Welcome back. On today's video, we're talking about how to deal with a crisis. Before we jump into how to deal with a crisis, let's look at what a crisis is, because sometimes we just think that a crisis is a massive change that is a natural disaster or something else, and a crisis could be something as simple as a job loss. It could be something as simple as a stock market portfolio hit, or it could be a major medical diagnosis. It could be a storm that wipes out your neighborhood or hurts a lot of people in your neighborhood. It's something that simply takes you from the current state, changes that state to something that creates urgent upheaval in your mind, your area, your community. And knowing how to address or how to deal with a crisis can help us become more successful in getting through any crises that we may face. So I wanted to look at a few different things. The first one I wanted to start with is the psychology of a crisis. And this is a resource that I found online. It generally deals with community crises and leaders for the community, how to deal with and understand what their communities are going through. But it had a few different things that I wanted to touch on that I thought were important. So let's jump right into that. And I'm going to scroll through this very quickly so this video doesn't become terribly long, but it talks about different things that happen in a crisis and how people address those. So this particular one, it talks about in a crisis, people take in information, and of course all my highlights just went away. Process information, act on information differently than they would during a non-crisis. And that's important because understanding that people don't necessarily respond psychologically like we would expect them to, or like they may in a normal time, is critical for our communicating and getting their cooperation in doing things that are in honestly everyone's best interest. So understanding that people are not going to act normally or like they might normally do in a non-crisis time is important for us if we're going to be able to help others act the right way. Here's things that people do, 4 ways that people process information during a crisis. Number 1, people tend to simplify messages. That doesn't necessarily mean a good thing, because it also means they may not fully hear information that's presented. They may not remember as much of the information that's presented to them. They misinterpret sometimes confusing action messages. And if people are being given direction on how to help resolve a crisis, we need to be all on the same page. People need to understand what does work, what does not work, and if we're not hearing all the information, not remembering what we hear and misinterpreting messages, that can be critical. So in a crisis, and we'll get into the steps that I usually have seen be successful, but we need to make sure that we're listening, we're hearing, and if we know that we have issues doing those generally, sometimes taking notes is not a bad thing. Other things people do is hold on to current beliefs, tend to exploit any conflicting or unclear messages about a subject by interpreting it as consistent with our existing beliefs. So we may misinterpret something. We may say, well, this expert says this, the other expert says that, so I'm going to go with what I want to hear. We may be more likely to take advice from a trusted source with which we are familiar, even if that trusted source has no clue what they're talking about. That could be a family member who says, well, here's what I think we should do, over a doctor who says, well, here's what we've seen be successful. Or it also could be one doctor who may be your family practice doctor over a specialist who deals with this issue time and time again. We look for additional information and opinions, and of course we should. We should be doing research and understanding what's happening, but we need to make sure we're doing it from trusted sources that know, not necessarily television channels or our favorite television channel when there are no experts in that field. So that's something that we've got to watch out for. We believe the first message, and this is something that's critical. Sometimes people will jump to a critical decision without doing the research, but if it's the first message out, it may not be the right one. Jumping into mental states, and this is something that's very important for us to understand about ourselves as well as others. During a disaster, people may experience a wide range of emotions. In fact, there's actually research that talks about different stages of grief that happen when people go through a crisis or a loss, and we'll jump into those here in a second. In fact, let's just jump in. There's 2 different models that you see. One is the 5 stages of grief, the other is 7 stages of grief. And from what I can tell, in the 7 stages of grief, they just added a couple. So in the 5 stages, you start with denial. Generally, people will start with, well, no, this isn't happening to me. It couldn't happen to me. In the 7 stages, and this is, I actually think, more accurate, a lot of times people start with shock. And this starts where they go into shock, they don't know how to respond, so they don't. And getting from shock to the next stage can be very difficult, and sometimes we just have to force ourselves to move forward. So instead of going through the 5 stages, since it incorporates all of them in the 7, let's just go through these. The second stage in this would be denial, where we're saying, no, this couldn't be happening to me. Maybe it's not right. Maybe I didn't hear it right. And denial is a self-protecting stage, but it doesn't necessarily help us get to anything. The next stage then would be anger. Mad that this is happening to us. Anger that we have to go through this. It doesn't make sense. And we may actually relate this to other people too. Well, why don't they have to go through it? It's not fair. Understanding that we're going to go through that is fine, as long as we don't limit ourselves from responding and acting on what we need to do. The 4th stage is bargaining, and you can see this with people, with kids you see it a lot, with people who are laid off from jobs, where they come back and say, well, what if I do this, or what if, or how about, and they start bargaining. Bargaining can be effective as long as it's producing results, but a lot of times it's not, especially if it's a severe situation where there's a medical condition or other things like that. We've got to work through the pieces. Step 5, or stage 5, is one of the additional stages that was not in the 5 stages of guilt, and that is, or the 5 stages of grief, and that's guilt. Some people may not see this, some people may. If a crisis happens to someone else, we may feel bad that it happened to them. So that is a stage that I would say not everyone goes through, but absolutely you could. 6 would be depression. And yes, in a grief situation, you may very well go through depression. Not everyone will, but it can be a good thing, because that's where we're starting to accept what's going on, and it's pre-acceptance, and it's pre-solution finding. So depression is a stage that we understand we will have to go through. It may be a sense of loss. It may be a sense of, I've worked in that field forever, or I had my health and I didn't use it, or whatever it may be, or I should have known that person better, I should have helped them out with whatever it may be. And depression it's a stage that we understand we have to go through, and as long as we get through it and move forward, it's not a bad thing. It's just a bad scenario. And then the last stage is acceptance. Why acceptance is so important is once you have accepted something as it is, it exists, it has happened, then you can move forward. You can move into the next thing. So understanding that in a lot of crises, we may go through these stages, and I have seen people go through them concurrently. I've seen people go up and down the scale, where they may be in denial one day, they may be bargaining, then they may be angry, then they may have guilt and depression. It happens. We have to get through these stages. So hopping back into the mental states in a crisis, understanding that people may experience a wide range of emotions then gives us the opportunity to recognize where they're at and help them move forward. Now, we're going to talk about some other stages here in a crisis and what we need to do, because if the crisis is imminent and something's happening that we have to address, we need to be able to motivate all the people around us, or help others around us get to the next step, whether it's safety or resolution or whatever it may be. But we have to understand that not everyone's going to be thinking the same way we are. And I'm going to scroll through these real quick. The next ones, understanding that people may be going through fear, anxiety, and dread. In a crisis, people respond differently. Some respond with fight, some respond with flight. We've all heard that. But there's all sorts of emotions mixed in. We can't necessarily change their state. We can only help them get through, or help them maximize what their response can be, and make sure that we do what we can to help them feel safe and help ourselves feel safe. Hopelessness and helplessness can be demotivating factors. People will not feel like they actually can impact anything. They can't get through this. Denial, of course, we already talked about that. Panic, what I thought was interesting in this article is it talked about people not necessarily acting completely irrational during a crisis. It's not like the movies where people go out and you see a mad rush of things. Now, does that happen? Of course it does. We've seen it happen at sporting events, at shopping events. We've seen it happen where there is a imminent natural disaster. But generally, people do not act like you may see in the movies. I think that's good news. Media coverage of a crisis is not what we all may expect, or it may be. It talks about sometimes people who watched exposure had worse reactions to that because they identified themselves as the victims. And we have to understand that media people are not experts. They may bring on perceived experts, but generally, they're not necessarily experts in the field of crisis management. And best efforts aside to try to help, sometimes media efforts may actually hurt. So let's get off of this, and I wanted to talk about the steps that I will generally, or I have seen be successful in dealing with a crisis. So a few different things. Number one, and you've heard me talk about this if you've been following this channel in any length of time, we don't want to go guardrail to guardrail. And what that means is, like you're driving down the freeway, you've got the guardrails on both sides. You don't want to take your car and slam into one and then slam into the other, because what's better is just using your steering wheel to direct yourself smoothly down the road. If there's a little hiccup in the road, or if there's a curve, you make a slight course correction, but you don't go hit both guardrails. And that's what I mean by saying going guardrail to guardrail. Number two is don't freeze. Freezing limits your action and makes it so that you will not be able to do anything to resolve your situation. Understanding that you will go through emotion is critical. And then what you can do to help offset that, what really helps us understand the nature of the crisis, is gathering information. What information is available? What can I learn? Who can help? Who do we have available to help? All of those different pieces. You may have, if it's a medical situation, you may have doctors, you may have other experts, you may have family members, you may have independent parties. And then doing your own research in a effective manner is critical. I was in a doctor's office a little while ago, and I saw a sign on the wall that said something to the effect of, "Don't let your Google research trump my years of medical experience." And I thought that was important, because sometimes we do tend to Google things and expect them to be more important or more knowledgeable than what a doctor said. However, what I also found when we were going through a medical crisis with one of my children is that Google is the number 3 tool doctors use to research medical conditions. And in that instance, we were able to do very similar research, make sure the research was from reliable sources, and have a good conversation with the doctor that ended up saving our child actually some significant pain and long-term effects. And after we were able to bring up all the information, and the doctor fortunately was he was very down to earth and not egocentric, we had a very honest conversation and were able to develop a course of action that worked out very well in that situation. So do your research, gather your information, get second opinions. Second opinions may be medical, they may be questioning assumptions, they may be from others who have had similar experiences. It should come from reliable sources that have some sort of backing, some sort of an informational, educational, factual backing that we can rely on, and then set a course of action. So here's the steps that I have come up with that have been successful in my life and I've seen help other people. Step 1, assess. Assess what is the actual issue. For example, if you have a flood happening in your house, is the water coming from inside or outside? Is it coming up for the storm drains, or is it coming from a burst pipe? Is it a medical condition? What's causing the medical issue? Do you have the right experts on your team? Is it a job loss? Is it a windstorm that knocked down? In one situation we saw, one of my employees had 14 trees on his house. What was the issue? Was his house in imminent need of collapsing, or were there safe situations that could be done? All of those are different pieces that we have to assess. Step 2, what are your resources? So I put it as resources. Who and what do you have available to you? Do you have people that can help you? Do you have experts that can help you? Do you have chainsaws to get things off your house? Do you have an auto mechanic that you know that can give you advice? Do you have a career person? Do you have a LinkedIn connection that may be able to get you into the job that you need so that you can afford to pay your bills? Resources make that possible. So step 1 is assess, step 2 is resources, step 3 then gets into mitigate. And these don't have to be in-depth, long-term things that you're analyzing. It may be, we've got a burst pipe, we need to shut off the water. Who can do that? Those are your steps right there for assess, resource, and mitigate. But mitigate is prioritizing your damage control by the most impactful first. What needs to happen first to stop the pain before you can start the resolution? After you do your mitigation, then you do a little bit of research. What information is available? What are we going through? What's happening? For example, with the COVID crisis, we needed to find expert people who knew what they were talking about, what actually would be effective, what could be done. With a job loss or with job crises, I have gone into companies where nothing's going right with the different people, and you have to analyze very quickly, is it the people, is it the process, or is it the product? What is happening? What can be done to resolve this? And you need to do research, you need to talk to people, you need to find out what's happening, before you can effectively resolve the problem. Too often with companies, I see that happen where someone just goes in and cleans house without understanding, do the people that they're getting rid of actually have something to add? And generally they do. The next piece then is formulate your initial plan. What are the next steps? What are we going to do? Who's going to help us? What resources do we have that we've already learned about? And how do we make those work for us? The next one is then act. Put your plan into action. Make sure that you are executing on the plan. Make sure people that are working with you are working the way that everyone has agreed to. And then the final step is reassess. Not every plan is going to work. What's a good key of crisis management is being able to tweak that plan and going back to what I first mentioned about not going guardrail to guardrail. Generally, people are pretty good at planning. Where they fail is not making tweaks or course corrections or adjustments to make sure the plan is actually working and that it's working to the most effect that it can. So walking back through those real quick: step 1, assess. Step 2, resources. Step 3, mitigate. Step 4, research. Step 5, initial plan. Step 6, act. And step 7, reassess, course corrections, and continue your action. If you take these, I believe it will help you. I've seen it help other people. If this video has been helpful to you, please give us a like down below. If you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you know someone who may benefit from this video, feel free to subscribe or feel free to share. Thank you. We'll see you on the next one.